Imagine voting in a referendum, 17.4 million of you, to take back control of British law from Brussels, to restore parliamentary sovereignty, to ensure British laws are made by British politicians accountable to British voters. Now imagine discovering that less than a decade later, your own Prime Minister is quietly drafting legislation to hand that control right back to European bureaucrats, except this time without even the pretense of having a vote or veto. That's not pragmatic cooperation. That's not sensible alignment. That's systematic reversal of the most significant democratic decision in modern British history, conducted through obscure legislation that most people won't notice until it's too late. Quick favor. If you're loving what we're doing here at British Mirror, hit that subscribe button and smash the bell icon. Over 94% of you haven't subscribed yet. It's completely free, takes about 2 seconds, and honestly means a world to us. Cheers if you've already done it. Right, back to the show. Sir Keir Starmer stands accused of proving what Brexiteers always suspected, that his ambition, and that of his government, is to reverse Brexit dishonestly through the back door without referendum or mandate. And the evidence is becoming impossible to ignore. Let's dive into this absolutely explosive accusation that the Prime Minister is betraying Brexit whilst pretending to honour it. Sir Keir Starmer is proving what we already knew, that his ambition, and that of his government, is to reverse Brexit dishonestly. Dishonestly. That's not suggesting he has different interpretation of Brexit or alternative approach to European relations. That's accusing him of deliberate deception, of saying one thing publicly whilst doing the opposite through obscure legislative mechanisms that avoid scrutiny. The Prime Minister is once again proving himself to be what George Canning called a steady patriot of the world, alone, the friend of every country but his own. That's devastating historical reference. George Canning was 19th century statesman criticizing politicians more concerned with international reputation than national interest. Calling Sir Keir this suggests he prioritizes global approval, European integration, international institutions over Britain's sovereignty and interests. Today, it has been revealed that new legislation is being drafted to transfer some post-Brexit laws to the EU, effectively allowing European powers to take over British law. Transfer laws to the EU. Let's be absolutely clear about what that means. Laws currently made by British Parliament, by elected British MPs accountable to British voters, would instead be determined by European institutions where Britain has no representation, no vote, no veto. The bill would, for the first time since Brexit, make Parliament cede control over key areas to foreign bureaucrats. First time since Brexit. So this isn't continuing the existing arrangement. This is reversing Brexit, taking powers laboriously repatriated to Westminster and voluntarily surrendering them back to Brussels. That's not evolution of Brexit. That's betrayal of it. Food standards, farming rules, animal welfare, and pesticide regulations are all set to be determined in Brussels through what is being called dynamic alignment, which means being told what to do. Dynamic alignment. That's Orwellian euphemism for automatic acceptance of whatever Brussels decides. It's not alignment as equals negotiating mutually beneficial standards. It's Britain accepting European regulations automatically, without discussion, without ability to refuse, which means being told what to do. Exactly. Britain becomes rule-taker rather than rule-maker, accepting dictation from Brussels on matters directly affecting British farmers, British food producers, British consumers. This means that when the EU changes its rules, our laws will automatically change too. Automatically. No parliamentary debate. No vote. No democratic input. Brussels decides. Britain complies. That's not sovereignty. That's colonial relationship where metropolitan power makes decisions, and periphery implements them without question. We would have no vote, no veto, and no say. We would simply be expected to obey orders. No vote, no veto, no say. That's 3 fundamental democratic rights stripped away. Britain becomes subject to European lawmaking without any influence over those laws. That's worse than EU membership because at least as members we had MEPs, commissioners, voting rights in council. This gives us obligations without representation. Taxation without representation was what sparked American Revolution. Regulation without representation might spark British one. In some cases, Britain could fall under the authority of the European Court of Justice, a foreign and political court that could overrule British laws on British soil. European Court of Justice. That's the EU supreme judicial body, enforcing European law across member states. For ECJ to have jurisdiction over Britain post-Brexit is absolute anathema to Leave voters who specifically wanted to end European court supremacy over British law. A foreign and political court. That's emphasizing ECJ isn't just foreign but politically motivated, advancing European integration agenda rather than neutrally interpreting law. Overrule British laws on British soil. That's complete surrender of legal sovereignty. British courts, British Parliament, British voters become subordinate to European judicial authority. That's not Brexit. That's remaining in EU without the membership benefits. This is not cooperation or diplomacy. It is deference and supplication to a supranational body, essentially turning us into a colony of the EU, governed by people we did not vote for. Deference and supplication. That's language of subjugation, of inferior power bowing to superior. Colony of the EU. That's provocative but captures a reality. Britain will be governed in key areas by institutions where we have no representation, exactly like colonies were governed by imperial powers without democratic input. Governed by people we did not vote for. That's a fundamental democratic deficit that made EU membership intolerable for Leave voters. And Cirquier is recreating it. We are being told that this is practical, that businesses already follow EU rules, and that it will boost growth. But this is balderdash. Balderdash. That's magnificent old-fashioned British word for complete nonsense. The argument that businesses already follow EU rules, so we might as well make it official, is circular logic that justifies any surrender of sovereignty. British businesses operating in Europe follow European rules for those operations. That doesn't mean Britain should adopt those rules domestically for businesses not trading with EU. EU economies are struggling, with Germany in decline, and the EU itself is responsible for its overregulation, the very reason we voted to leave. Germany in decline. That's not hyperbole. Germany, Europe's economic engine, is experiencing recession, deindustrialization, energy crisis partly self-inflicted through environmental policies. The EU model is failing, and Sir Keir wants Britain to align more closely with it. That's not pragmatism. That's ideological commitment to European integration, regardless of economic evidence. We are seeing the same pattern from the Prime Minister across his political career. Pattern. That's arguing this is an isolated incident, but consistent behavior revealing Sir Keir's true priorities. When he was in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, he consistently called for a second referendum. Second referendum. That was Remainers' strategy for reversing Brexit. Have another vote, hope for different result. Keep voting until you get answer you want. That's not democracy. That's using democratic process to overturn democratic result you dislike. He said, and this quote is absolutely damning, as a party, we have already voted 3 times against a second referendum, with a 3-line whip behind it. And I can tell you today that an incoming Labour government would legislate for a referendum immediately upon taking power and hold that referendum within 6 months. Legislate for referendum immediately, hold it within 6 months. That's not careful consideration of whether circumstances warrant another vote. That's predetermined commitment to reversing first referendum before even knowing what Brexit would look like. It reveals Sir Keir never accepted the 2016 result and was determined to overturn it at first opportunity. As leader of the opposition, he once said, when asked to choose between Davos or Westminster, Davos. Davos over Westminster. That's extraordinary answer revealing where his loyalties lie. Davos is a World Economic Forum, annual gathering of global elites discussing international governance, globalization, multilateral institutions. Westminster is British Parliament, seat of British democracy, where British laws are made. Asked to choose, Sir Keir picked the international elite gathering over British democratic institution. Why? Because Westminster is too constrained. Too constrained by what? By democratic accountability, by national sovereignty, by having to respect voters. That quote reveals Sir Keir sees British democracy as obstacle to implementing globalist agenda he prefers. How could any British politician choose a skiing resort over his own country? That's rhetorical question highlighting the absurdity. But the answer is clear. Sir Keir prioritizes international institutions, global governance, multilateral cooperation over national sovereignty and democratic accountability. As Prime Minister, he introduced a so-called Great EU Reset scheme, handing over our fishing rights and massively overpaying for the Erasmus scheme. Handing over fishing rights. British fishing was a symbolic Brexit issue, representing sovereignty over natural resources. Giving it back to EU demonstrates Sir Keir's willingness to surrender Brexit gains for closer European ties. Massively overpaying for Erasmus. That student exchange program that Britain left after Brexit because cost exceeded benefits. Rejoining at inflated price shows Sir Keir values European integration over fiscal responsibility. Last month, he said, "We are getting closer relationships with the EU on a number of fronts, including trade and the economy, because that is good for businesses across our country. Within these constraints, we will move closer. Within these constraints, we will move closer." What constraints? Manifesto commitments? Public opinion? The constraints Sir Keir identifies are ones is systematically dismantling through incremental alignment that avoids triggering political backlash. It's boiling frog strategy, gradual temperature increase so the frog doesn't notice it's being cooked. Except British voters are starting to notice. Starmer has always been devoted to multinational, globalist bureaucratic organizations more than Britain, more than preserving the nation-state, more than sovereignty, and more than respecting the will of the voters. Always been devoted. That's arguing this is core ideological commitment, not tactical positioning or pragmatic adjustment. Sir Keir genuinely believes supranational governance is superior to national sovereignty, that experts in Brussels make better decisions than democratic processes in Britain, that global institutions should override national preferences. Whether you agree with that worldview or not, it's fundamentally incompatible with Brexit's core premise, that Britain should govern itself through institutions accountable to British voters. This approach is not popular, and it will not lead to economic growth. Not popular is evident from polling showing Labour collapsing. Will not lead to growth is economic argument that European model, with its heavy regulation and sclerotic institutions, doesn't produce dynamism or prosperity. Brexit was supposed to unleash British potential through deregulation, trade deals, innovation. Realigning with European regulatory framework prevents that. Despite several humiliating losses in Parliament just last night and concerns over cost, security, and consent, the government is still pressing ahead with handing over British territory to Mauritius, an ally of China, against the will of the British people. Handing over British territory to Mauritius. That's Chagos Islands, strategic archipelago including Diego Garcia military base. Mauritius' ally of China raises security concerns about Chinese influence over strategic territory. Against will of British people emphasizes democratic deficit where government pursues policy despite public opposition. Taxpayers could be forced to pay billions of pounds for the privilege. Pay billions to give away British territory. That's not just strategically questionable. That's fiscally insane. Britain is paying to surrender sovereignty.